As you see on the screen, this talk that I'm going to give today is the work of a team effort. I'm delighted that several of my co-investigators are also present here today. That's Sarah Ongun, Julia Hofweber, and Michal Korenar. I must say that it was a brilliant team to be on, and I'm really have benefited so much from working with these colleagues. If anything went well on this project, it's definitely the result of the cooperation between the team. And if anything did not go so well, that's definitely that I am to blame for that. So without further ado, let's go and look at what we're going to talk about today. So the first concept I'd like to introduce is the concept of the bilingual advantage. The bilingual advantage refers to the advantage bilinguals sometimes have been found to have over monolinguals with respect to the functioning of their attention control systems. That is the range of high-level control functions that support goal-directed behavior. So for example, in experimental tasks, bilinguals have been found to be faster at suppressing irrelevant information. They have been found to be faster at switching between tasks or at monitoring conflict. But the key question behind all this is, what is it then in the bilingual advantage, in the bilingual experience, that gives bilinguals this advantage? Is it the fact that they speak more than one language? Or is it the fact that they participate in different cultures? Or is it the fact that they have this immigration experience? And that is a question that we would like to answer. So one of the issues we'll be looking at as potential sources of this advantage is the role of code switching. Now, code switching is not monolithic behavior. There are different types of code switching, and I'd like to highlight that in this talk as well. You're making use of the model that Marie-Curie has introduced in 2000 and 2013. We will also look at culture, in particular at multicultural identity. Now, the novelty of our approach to this topic is that we measure multicultural identity not just at the group level, but we also measure it at individual level. So we have a questionnaire, a multicultural identity scales questionnaire that allows us to look at multicultural identity at the level of the individual. So the other aspect that is novel about our project is that we then keep the languages constant and we keep immigration status constant. So the groups that we're looking at are Turkish-English bilinguals in the UK. Both groups are immigrants, but they're different from a cultural perspective. So we're going to look at the results of this project and we finish with a discussion conclusion, and we'll then discuss the limitations and ways forward. I would like to begin by paying tribute to the work of Albert Costa, who was probably one of the first to highlight the fact that code switching is very important in studies of the bilingual advantage. He writes in his famous paper, Bilingual Advantage, now you see it, now you don't, that bilingual speakers often have to keep track of which language to speak to whom. And this activity may entail monitoring processes of the sort involved in executive functioning in general. And this may consequently be at the basis of the bilingual advantage in this domain. So there is this great puzzle that anybody who works on bilingual processing has to face. And this puzzle is that on the one hand, bilinguals can keep their languages separate, but at the same time, they can code switch between these languages in settings that are appropriate. So how can we account for that? Well, to do that, we need to make use of these attentional control mechanisms, also called executive functions, these high-level processes that allow us to regulate our behavior. Now, the claim is that code switching is controlled by the same mechanisms as the mechanisms used by monolinguals to, for example, switch between tasks. And if that is correct, if code switching is being used by the same mechanisms, then code switching can be assumed to train executive functions. And these might include shifting between tasks, updating of working memory, or inhibition, the suppression of irrelevant information. And I've put it in bold on this slide because that is the executive function we will be looking at in the talk today. As many people will know, there is a large controversy over the robustness of the bilingual advantage and the role, also in the role of code switching in it. And our claim today will be that we need to look in more detail at what code switching is, and we need to look in more detail at multicultural identity if we want to perhaps make a contribution to the controversy over this bilingual advantage and resolving this controversy. The ideas put forward by Albert Costa have been further developed by Green and Abu-Talebi in their adaptive control hypothesis. I think this is very well known because it's very widely used in the field at the moment. And they say that inhibitory control is not unitary across different contexts, but adapts to the different demands placed upon it in different contexts. And they distinguish between single language contexts, where bilinguals use one language exclusively in, for example, the work context, and another language in another context, for example, at home. And there's very little code switching between the languages. In dual language contexts, different languages are used with different interlocutors. So code switching may take place there, but only between utterances. This is what we call intersentential code switching in the code switching literature. And the third context distinguished in the adaptive control hypothesis is the dense code switching context where speakers freely mix both languages within one utterance. This is called intrasentential code switching in the code switching literature. So the important bit about the ACH is that it makes a link between code switching and cognitive control. So they say in the dual language context, strong demands are placed on inhibition and monitoring. And that is because you then need to completely inhibit the language that is not being required in this situation. On the other hand, no inhibition and monitoring is required according to the ACH in a dense code switching context. We don't quite agree with that in the article that Julia Hofweber and Theo Marinis and I published in 2019. We say that conflict monitoring is definitely needed if you construe an utterance containing words from two languages. If the grammars diverge quite substantially, you have to make sure that these grammars talk to each other in the sentence, that these grammars match onto each other. You find slots where you can actually add words from another language, and that is no mean feat. Green and Abu-Talebi say that in the dense code switching context, speakers mainly rely on opportunistic planning. And that means making use of whatever comes most readily to hand in order to achieve a goal. Well, if that is the case, then we would predict idiosyncratic variability in code switching. Everybody uses opportunistic planning in the way they think is best. But in reality, what we find in the code switching literature is very clear patterns of code switching depending on typology. Different languages with different typologies have different code switching patterns. And we also find that there is sociolinguistic variables that co-vary with these patterns. So it's unlikely that opportunistic planning is solely responsible for code switching in the dense code switching context. That doesn't mean that opportunistic planning doesn't exist, but it's not enough to account for code switching in these contexts. Evidence for this comes from the study that Julia Hofweber carried out in 2016, where she studied English-German bilinguals from two different groups. One was the first generation bilinguals in the UK, English-German bilinguals, and the second group, the fifth generation English-German bilinguals in South Africa. And she found that the ones in South Africa had the smallest conflict effect on the flankers task. And that is also the group that produced most of the congruent lexicalization, that is the most intimate form of code switching within a sentence. So the more participants indicated they densely code switched, the better they performed at conflict monitoring. So this clearly shows that dense code switching is not necessarily negative for cognitive control, as is claimed by the AH. Coming back then to the study of the bilingual advantage and the different variables that might play a role in there. If I do a study of English-French bilinguals in the UK, and I look at cognitive control or whatever variable I'm interested in, and I compare them with monolinguals in France, then obviously one of the differences is that the ones in the UK are bilingual and the ones in France are monolingual. But that's not the only difference between the groups, because the ones in the UK are also immigrants, and the ones in the UK are also potentially at least bicultural. So bilingualism co-varies with culture and or immigration status. And it's important to try and disentangle the role of these different variables in studies of cognitive control. Researchers who have done that have come to different conclusions. So the researchers listed here found that language is more important than culture. And on the other hand, there are researchers who found the opposite and said that culture is more important than language. But it could also be immigration status, or it could all depend on the task. Right? It depends on whether you use a Simon task or a flanker task. You might get very different results. So our contribution to this debate will be to say, let's look in more depth at multicultural identity, and this might help to move the research agenda forward. In a very famous paper, Gigi Luck and Ellen Bialystok wrote, bilingualism is not a categorical variable. Bilingualism is a complex variable, and a monolingual and a bilingual group might differ from each other, but actually bilingualism is on a scale. It's not a 0 versus 100% kind of variable. We would like to add to this that culture is not a categorical variable either. As François Grosjean put it in 2015, bilinguals take part to varying degrees in the life of 2 or more cultures. And there is a very interesting model of multicultural identity written by his colleagues, West and his colleagues, and they say there are actually a couple of strategies that bilinguals use on a daily basis to negotiate their identities. And one of these is hybridizing. So that means synthesizing pre-existing cultures into a new and distinct form by actively combining elements of both cultures. So that could be, for example, that's an example they give, when Asian students combine Western individualistic values with collectivist values in their own personal values. So that's one strategy people can use. The other strategy they can use is frame switching. That means activating one of the 2 cultural systems in response to cultural context. Just to give you an example from the UK, when I moved to the UK, I learned to apologize far more than I was used to do from the Dutch culture that I come from. And when I am among Dutch people, I will not apologize so much. But when I'm among British people, I will apologize far more. So that would be an example of frame switching. Multicultural identity styles is a term used by Ward et al. And that's very similar to the concepts distinguished by West and colleagues. So they use the term hybrid identity style for bilinguals who blend different elements from different cultures, and alternating identity styles for those who try to keep both identities separate and alternate between these different identities. So blending and hybridization are more or less the same thing, and frame switching and alternating. Now, this is relevant because it enables us to make predictions that lead into the cognitive domain. So West et al. Say that through continual practice with frame switching, biculturals may develop increased context sensitivity. And this is a key concept we will be using in this study as well. So what does that actually mean? Well, it means that biculturals who engage in frame switching consistently monitor their context for cultural cues that flag up the need to switch to a different cultural frame in the ways that are comparable to switching between languages. So going back to the example of the apologies, if a British person joins a group
people that are talking, I would be inclined to apologize more, and when that person leaves, I would be inclined to do less of that. So the cue that I'd be looking out for is the identity of the person, the culture that that person belongs to, and then I will change my behavior. So monitoring the context, that's interesting for executive functions, because monitoring is one of the executive functions that is distinguished in Green and Abu Talabi's adaptive control hypotheses. And also other researchers, Yi et al., who have already said, yes, switching between cultures is likely to recruit executive functions. So our claim is that the degree to which bilinguals adopt multicultural identities could constitute an important source of variability that has been neglected in studies of the relationship between bilingualism and executive functions. Let's now quickly have a look at code switching, because there's still very little attention being paid to the different types of code switching that bilinguals might engage in. And as we have shown in earlier work, it's different types of code switching that may affect different aspects of the executive system. If we do not pay attention to the different types of code switching, then the effect of code switching on executive functions may remain unclear. So what types of code switching are we talking about? I'm using here the Muysken model from 2013, which distinguishes 4 different types of code switching that have been validated on the basis of a study of a very wide range of language pairs. And I'm giving examples from English-Turkish code switching from the literature. So we see here, first of all, insertion. We have a Turkish sentence, a Turkish frame, and inserted into that frame, we see 2 English nouns. So that's one type of code switching, very frequent type of code switching. This differs from alternation, where we have loosely connected phrases from 2 languages that alternate. So here we have a Turkish main clause, and subject and verb, and then there is a prepositional phrase. It's an adjunct, a longer stretch that follows this verb. Backflagging is the 3rd type, where we have, in this particular case, an English sentence from a Turkish-English bilingual in London, and to this sentence, the speaker adds a discourse marker from Turkish, the heritage language. And the 4th type is the most intimate form of code switching, where you co-activate the grammar and the semantics and the lexicon of both languages. So here we see a sentence that consists of 3 words, 2 Turkish words and 1 English word. And the English word is a copula. So it looks as if it is an insertion of an English copula into a Turkish sentence, but insertions tend to be content words and not function words. It is classified as congruent lexicalization also because of the presence of this cognate Augustos, which is almost the same as August, and that makes it very difficult to say where actually the switch in the language takes place. It's very important that congruent lexicalization is much more likely to happen between languages that are typologically similar, such as English and German, that Julia Hofweber investigated, than between languages that are very different from each other, like English and Turkish. But as we've just seen, there can be areas where suddenly the languages are quite similar in surface structure or in the vocabulary that is being used. So it's not impossible that congruent lexicalization takes place in Turkish-English code switching. The other important point is that congruent lexicalization is much more likely to happen with bilingual groups that have a long tradition of language contact. And that is likely to be the case with the Cypriot Turkish speakers, because Cyprus was for a long time a British colony, and there have been long-standing contacts between the 2 countries. So we come to the current project. What do we want to do? We want to contribute to disentangling the impact of language, culture, and identity on executive functions.
So as I said, the new thing about our project is that we keep the languages and immigration context constant, but vary the sociocultural background of the participants. So we have two groups of Turkish-speaking immigrants to the UK, one from mainland Turkey and one from northern Cyprus. And I will explain in a little bit more detail later on how these groups are expected to differ from the perspective of culture. But first, our hypotheses. We assume there is a bilingual advantage, and we hypothesize that the two bilingual groups I've just mentioned will outperform a group of English monolinguals on an executive functions task. With respect to code switching, we have two different hypotheses following the work of Hofberger et al. 2016. Bilinguals who practice congruent lexicalization will outperform others as a result of the enhanced training they receive in executive functions. So if that's the case, we would expect the Cyprus-born bilinguals to outperform the Turkey-born bilinguals, because the Cyprus-based ones are expected to use more congruent lexicalization. The opposite hypothesis would be one based on the adaptive control hypothesis, that those who practice congruent lexicalization most would underperform by comparison with those who do this less often. Because according to the ACH, you don't need monitoring and inhibition if you practice congruent lexicalization. You don't engage those executive functions. So then you get the opposite results, that the Cyprus-based bilinguals will be less good than the Turkish-based bilinguals, Turkey-born bilinguals. With respect to multicultural identity, we first of all compare the two groups. We assume that the Cyprus-born bilinguals will have higher levels of hybrid identity styles than the Turkey-born bilinguals, because the Cyprus-born have this long tradition of contact with English and with the UK. With respect to the individual differences that we're going to look at, we have two competing hypotheses. One is that if language is the key determining factor behind any bilingual advantage, then code switching practices will explain variance in over and above measures of multicultural identity. And if culture is the key factor, then measures of multicultural identity will explain variance in executive functions over and above code switching. Right, coming to the methods, very briefly, the participants, first of all. So there is 29 adults, immigrants from Turkey in the UK, the 28 adult immigrants from Cyprus in the UK, and 30 monolingual speakers of English in the UK. Within group variables, the code switching patterns, the multicultural identity styles, so hybrid identity styles and alternating identity styles. And then there is the flanker task results, the conflict effects in the reaction times, and the reaction times on the incongruent trials. They've both been used in this study to look at inhibitory control. Of course, in a study like that, you need to control for key variables such as age, education, working memory, and nonverbal reasoning. So that's what we're doing as well. Just coming back to these participants and the difference between the groups, it is a lot of evidence from the literature that these two groups of bilinguals are clearly distinct from the perspective of identity. The Circuit in a new book from 2016 says that these two groups have been observed in living in different ethnic, ideological, cultural, and religious communities for decades. And many Turkish Cypriots also report a high level of perceived symbolic threat to the values and norms of the Turkish Cypriots posed by mainland Turks living in Cyprus. And at the same time, they feel threatened by the Greek Cypriots in Cyprus. So they are a minority in Cyprus, and they're also a minority in London as immigrants. Do these bilinguals code switch? Yes, they do. There is quite a lot of literature on those in America and some also in Europe. And it's very clear that they do practice code switching and also that there is intergenerational variability in these patterns. But there is no analysis of the code switching patterns in Muisken's framework so far. As I said before, the Turkish Cypriots, because of the longer tradition of language contact with English, are expected to engage more in congruent lexicalization than the other ones. So coming to the tasks, the flanker task is what we use. It's often assumed to be a pure measure of executive functions, of inhibition in particular. So what did it consist of? 48 congruent and 48 incongruent trials presented in random order. So what you see on the screen is a series of 5 arrows, and the respondent needs to indicate in which direction the middle arrow points. And if the middle arrow points in the same direction as the other 4 arrows, then it's a congruent stimulus. And if the middle arrow points in the other direction, it's an incongruent stimulus. So people are slower at the incongruent stimulus than at the congruent one, and they more often get a mistake with the incongruent stimulus. You can then compute the conflict effect by subtracting the mean of the incongruent trials and the congruent stimulus trials. For fluid intelligence or nonverbal reasoning, we used the visual puzzles task from the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scales. And for working memory, we used forward and backward digit span from the same test. And finally, we had the language history questionnaire, measuring language knowledge and use. We had the code switching frequency task. This is a task we developed ourselves on the basis of the available literature on Turkish-English code switching, supplemented with examples from Turkish-German and Turkish-Danish code switching, so other combinations where Turkish is spoken in combination with a Germanic language. And these were then translated. So this consisted of 98 stimuli, and in both directions. So we had monolingual sentences as control sentences. We also had switches between sentences, and we had mixed verbal compounds that we haven't used in this particular case, but we used within these, every type of code switching was represented by 14 examples. So this was presented to the participants in visual and audio formats. So we had a standard Turkish version and we had a Cypriot Turkish version, and they heard the sentences and saw them on screen. And then they were asked, how often do you come across this type of sentence when talking to other Turkish Cypriot people in the UK? We did not ask them for a grammaticality judgment, because then you trigger all sorts of normative statements, and they probably would not accept any of this. But we asked for, if you hear it in your environment, the assumption is that you actually use that kind of code switching yourself too. We recorded answers on a visual analog scale ranging from 0 to 100, and people put across where they thought their answer would lie. We did a similar thing with the Multicultural Identity Style scale, which consists of 14 items. So the alternating identity scale says statements such as, I alternate between being British and Turkish, depending on the circumstances. And the hybrid identity scale said, I see myself as a culturally unique mixture of British and Turkish. Now, we carried out a factor analysis on this task and also on the code switching task, but I haven't got the time to explain all that, but I can give you the reference to the publication and then you can look that up yourself, just to make sure that indeed there were different dimensions as intended by the authors of this task, which was indeed the case. So procedure, the tasks were taken in the same order by all participants, except for the executive functions tasks. So we also had a task switching task, which we don't use in the current presentation, but that task and the flanker task were counterbalanced across groups. The others were taken in the order as represented on the screen. Data cleaning. We used procedures that are widely used in analyses of the flanker task. So error trials on the flanker task were excluded from further analyses, and outlier responses deviating by more than 3 standard deviations from the mean for each participant were trimmed separately for congruent and incongruent trials. That eliminated again a couple of trials. And we carried out an exploratory analysis of the data to establish whether there were any extreme values at group level, and this also led to removal of 4 informants. Coming to the results, let's first just simply look at the descriptive results, the code switching patterns. So in blue, we see the Turkey-born bilinguals, and in green, the Cyprus-born bilinguals. And we go from left to right with monolingual sentences, English, monolingual Turkish sentences. This is the code switching between sentences, and the last 2 bars represent switching within sentences or mixing. And this difference is just marginally significantly different in that the Cyprus-born bilinguals use a little bit more of mixing within sentences, and that is in particular related to congruent lexicalization. But it's a very small effect, but it's exactly as we had expected. With respect to multicultural identity scales, we did indeed find that the Cyprus-born bilinguals express a stronger multicultural identity than the Turkey-born bilinguals. But it was a little bit unexpected that it was true both for the hybrid identity styles and for the alternating identity styles. So we had expected it would be mainly for the hybrid identity styles that they would be stronger, but it's for both the hybrid and the alternating identity styles. Well, and then we come to the differences in the conflict effect on the flanker task. We see here in green the Cyprus-born bilinguals and the Turkey-born bilinguals, and here in pink, the monolinguals. And we see that the largest conflict effect is with the monolinguals and the smallest with the Cyprus-born bilinguals. Now, the averages that are represented here are adjusted for the level, for the effect of the covariates, because obviously we need to control for all these covariates before we can make such comparisons. So this was quite an interesting result. But then we put together the results of the, oh, I wish I could move this. Oh yeah, I can move this a little bit. There we are. Then we looked at the correlations between the incongruent RTs on the flanker tasks and code switching on the one hand, and multicultural identity on the other hand. So begin with the code switching frequency task here. We see that the results was really disappointing because we don't find any significant correlation between code switching and the flanker task result. And the code switching task didn't correlate with age, not with education, nonverbal reasoning, working memory, and the multicultural identity questionnaire. So that was very disappointed. So that was a difficult moment in our project. But fortunately, we had the multicultural identity questionnaires, and we see now this very interesting result that indeed the multicultural identity questionnaires correlate very strongly with incongruent means from the reaction times on the flanker task. So in other words, people who score highly on hybrid identity or highly on alternating identity have a very small, short reaction times on incongruent trials on the flanker task. So that was very interesting. So we then put that result into a hierarchical regression analysis. That means that we first put in all the covariates in the first step, and then we got a significant model. So that means education, working memory, age, and nonverbal reasoning. They all went in the first step. And after that, we added the alternating identities in the second step, and again got a significant model and a significant R squared change as well. which is very important. And in the third step, we then added hybrid identities, which led again to a significant, very small increase in explained variance. If we turn these two around, it's exactly the same effect. You don't see code switching in here because, as I said, it did not even correlate with our executive functions measure. So there was no point in adding it. We see that the strength of the two multicultural identity variables differs considerably, and that alternating identities was the strongest predictor. You see it very clearly in this regression line where we regressed incongruent RT mean on the alternating identity styles. So the higher people scored on alternating identity styles, the shorter the reaction times on incongruent trials on the flanker task. That's quite a surprising result, in fact, very interesting, I feel. So, in summary, we found that code switching frequency did not explain variance in RTs on incongruent trials on the flanker task, contrary to our predictions. But the two multicultural identity variables explained 32% of variance in executive functions, over and above all the covariates. And in total, the explained variance was 49%. And we found that alternating identities was more important in explaining performance on executive functions than hybrid identities. So coming back to our original hypotheses, we can say, yes, it is indeed the case that in our study there was a bilingual advantage. The two bilingual groups outperformed the monolinguals after carefully controlling for the covariates. We do that in various ways in the paper, and I refer to the details of that in the written version, but we definitely controlled for the relevant covariates in that analysis. For code switching, we had the hypothesis based on our previous work that those who practice congruent lexicalization most would outperform others. And that was indeed the case, because the Cyprus-born bilinguals engaged a little bit more in congruent lexicalization. And they were also the ones that were the best at the flankers task. So we have no evidence for the hypothesis 2b, which was based on the adaptive control hypothesis, which said that if a person practices congruent lexicalization, they don't need to make use of inhibition and monitoring to the same extent as people who don't. So we have no evidence for hypothesis 2b. With respect to the intergroup differences, we had hypothesized that the Cyprus-born bilinguals had higher levels of hybrid identity styles than the Turkey-born bilinguals, and that was borne out. But we also found that they had higher levels of achievement on the alternating identity style scale. And with the individual differences, hypotheses, oops, I'm just go back. We've found that it's not language that was the key determining factor behind any bilingual advantage, but culture was the key defining factor over and above code switching in our study. So how do we explain all this? As I said earlier in this talk, the higher scores of the Cyprus-born bilinguals on the multicultural identity style scales may be due to the identity threat. That's one of the key drivers of the dynamics of social identity processes. But of course, we don't want to say that it's good to have identity threats and then you'll do better on a cognitive control task. That wouldn't make any sense. What does make sense, we think, is to make reference to this notion of context sensitivity. If you practice frame switching, in that you switch between different identities on a regular basis, you develop a heightened context sensitivity. And that is an advantage on a flanker task. Why is that? Because in a flanker task, you need to constantly pay attention to the context. You constantly need to look at not only the arrow in the middle, but you have to look at the context as well. You are distracted by the context. So you probably get a training to do well on the flanker task if you are a person who engages in frame switching or alternating between identities. That's the claim. So wider implications. Frame switching that's what our project shows, leads to more cognitive advantages than hybridizing, although hybridizing also leads to cognitive advantages on the flanker task. The question is now whether the preferences for hybridizing or frame switching can also explain bicultural's performance on other EF tasks. So if you have a Simon task, for example, that induces conflict with a spatial stimulus response mismatch. So it's possible that context sensitivity is less important for this task. If that's the case, then a person who scores highly on frame switching does not necessarily do better on a Simon task. Now that's interesting because we have already found in the literature that Simon task performance and flanker task performance do not necessarily correlate. So this could be due to the fact that one recruits context sensitivity more than the other. In conclusion, the key finding is the key variable that explains executive functions performance in our study was culture rather than bilingualism. Even though I was very keen, of course, with my history of looking at code switching and the impact of code switching on executive functions in the current study, it was rather culture than code switching. So the novelty of our approach was to keep the languages as well as the immigration status constant so that we could actually look into cultural identity in depth. And we looked at it at the individual level and not just at the group level, because to us, culture is not a categorical variable. So we draw the lesson from this study that it's very important to incorporate sociocultural variables in studies of bilingualism and cognitive control, and indeed in models of bilingual speech processing. And the respondents' degree of multiculturalism needs to be taken into account in future studies of the bilingual advantage. There are, of course, limitations to our study. Was our task really appropriate and the best task to measure code switching behavior? We spent a lot of time developing this task and the results were a little bit disappointing. It is, of course, a receptive task. Now, in the study that Julia Hofweber carried out, there was a correlation between the scores on the receptive task and the scores on the productive task of code switching. Whether that was also the case for our informers, we do not yet know, but we are trying to find out whether we can get information about their productive code switching behavior. The second problem, it might be that in Turkish-English bilinguals, congruent lexicalization is not that common, and that is because of the typological distance between the languages. Congruent lexicalization is what you find between languages that are very similar, such as English and German, or Dutch and Frisian. But in Turkish and English, it's a bit of a long shot. But of course, there are examples where it's possible, as in the example with Augustos is iğrenç. August is terrible, where August and Augustos are actually very similar words. So you can have words that overlap even in very distinct languages, and there can be structures that at least at the surface level overlap. So it's not excluded, but it's not a typical language pair where you would find a lot of congruent lexicalization. The other issue might be the choice of the high monitoring flanker task. So that means a flanker task where you get 50% of congruent and 50% of incongruent trials. And the performance of bilinguals might differ depending on the level of monitoring needed for the task. So if you have 92 items that are congruent and only 8 that are incongruent, then it's a very different kind of task. And as shown in the article from 2019, bilinguals excel in the aspects of cognitive control which are trained by their code switching practices. And this is to do potentially with reactive and proactive monitoring. So proactive monitoring might be related to congruent lexicalization and reactive monitoring to alternation. And you can read that in the article from 2019. So we could recommend that researchers in future look at different types of flanker tasks with different monitoring level to explore the relationship between code switching habits and inhibition in more depth. And because our informers did not use congruent lexicalization that much, it may be that a high monitoring flanker task was perhaps not the right task to measure cognitive control, or at least to measure the relationship between cognitive control and code switching. We'd like to also mention the point made by Porch and Krot that it's one of the problems in the field is also that the data analysis process and treatment of outliers are different from study to study, and that might affect outcomes. So that's one point that we would like to raise also here at the end. That's something that the field would need to look at. So if you'd like more information, then please have a look at our paper in Frontiers in Psychology, and also to the lots of other papers that have appeared in this article collection on behavioral and neurophysiological approaches to code switching and language switching. I'd like to finish by saying thanks to the Center for Literacy and Multilingualism for sponsoring this study, to Arpita Bose for advice on data cleaning, and to all participants in the project, and to you all for listening to the talk. Thank you.